life, herding a passel of smelly goats from Florida to Maine to Washington and California. His name was given to him by his many fans who saw him on the highways and byways of this great nation. His name is Ches McCartney, and he is known all over this nation as the Goat Man. During his 30-odd years on the road, he traveled hundreds of thousands of miles and had been in 49 of the 50 states and into Canada. In order for you to understand his way of life, I feel it only proper to give you some of his background. Charles Ches McCartney was born at Van Buren Township near Wauchier in Keokuk County, Iowa, the son of William Albert McCartney and Levizie Russell McCartney on July 6, 1901. Iowa is farming country, and most all in this area farm, and it seems that even at a young age, Charlie, as he was called in Iowa, did not fit in.
Ches McCartney was born in Sigourney, Iowa, which is in the southeastern corner of the state, on July 6, 1901. A lot of people have heard varying ages for him, 104, 108, but he's actually 91 years old as of this time. And he was born on a farm, lived about 5-6 miles out of a town called Sigourney, which is just north of Ottumwa, Iowa. He lived on a small 20-acre farm in a log cabin. He always had goats. Even though he lived on a small farm, they kept goats. He was known to be an eccentric even as a child. A lot of the other kids made fun of him because he was different.
They used to always have box suppers. That was a customary thing in the country schools. I can remember even when I was in country school. But what they would do, they'd have these box suppers, and then a teacher or somebody of the that would act as an auctioneer, and you hold it up and try to get, like an auction sale, quarter or 50 cents or something like that, and then proceeds went from these box suppers. Then it went to school to buy old books or maybe a globe or swing outside or something of that nature. And one time Charlie was there at a box supper, and my mother's one sister, I found in an old diary where she did eat with him. But I can remember one time when I was in school, that was a lot of years later, they had a box supper, and the girl had the box. She wouldn't claim her box after the box was sold when he bought it. And I think it was around, maybe paid 50 or 60 cents for it or something like that. And the girl just wouldn't claim her box just because he bought it.
Well, my husband would be 87 if he were alive. So Charlie was older than he was, but he wasn't very bright. So you know how the country schools were, or maybe you don't know how they were. It was one big room, and the grades were all together. And Charlie would have been bigger, but I said, the kids picked on him because he wasn't too bright, really.
And that school was located where?
Just across from where the land is. Charlie didn't have very far to go to school, just across and down the road just a little. And I haven't been out that road for a while, so I'm not sure whether that building is there anymore. I think maybe it's gone too now. It's out in Van Buren Township, about 7-8 miles out. Not very far. And they picked on him rudely. I'm not going to tell you all the things he used to say they did to Charlie.
But he did end up being the butt of a lot of jokes.
Yes, they picked on him a lot. I suppose there were about 12 or 14 kids in that school at that time.
So he's kind of been a social outcast his whole life. hasn't he?
Then when they came to town, he still wasn't very big. I can't just remember how that story went, but I really don't know how far he went in school. I don't know whether he really continued very long at all. I think he... Wish my husband was here, he could tell you.
But to talk to him now, he reads a lot. I mean, he knows what's going on.
Oh, I don't doubt it a bit. There's no reason he shouldn't. He's spent all his life at it. I don't know. As I told you, a lot of people are not heroes in their own hometown. And Charlie may be a lot better man than I think he is. And probably is, because I haven't seen him in years. He could have changed an awful lot.
At the age of 14, he ran off to New York City. There he met a girl who was a Spanish knife thrower. She was 24, and they got married and lived together for at least a couple of years. She made her living by throwing knives at him in the local bars and pubs. And since the bigger tips came when she threw knives closer and closer to his head, he made sure that the knives were real sharp so that she wouldn't have to pick them up and throw them again. Then after a couple of years with her, he returned to Sigourney, had another wife that I haven't been able to track down, supposedly was from Chicago, and then married Sadie Smithhart, who is the mother of Gene, his only son that we can prove exists at this time, though I suspect there are other children and other wives around. He was well known for his goat wagon around Sigourney. He used to go to all the local fairs, and he would go to the Wattier Fair whenever the carnival came once or twice a year and would wrestle. That was the way he made some spending money, was by wrestling.
I knew Charlie when I was a kid, and he lived out northwest of Sigourney, and he always drove goats and wagon. And one time in Sigourney had a carnival, and Charlie wrestled a black bear down there and licked him. Everybody thought that was quite a thing.
Was you down there at that time? Did you see it?
Yeah, I seen it. I was just a kid, but I remembered. I don't know. It's been a long time ago, but I remembered him. When they brought him on the stage, they pulled him on with his hair. He never walked on. They drug him on by his hair. He wrestled that bear and licked him. But Charlie's pretty well known everywhere. He was kind of odd, but he was good-hearted.
And, you know, just whatever other odd jobs he could pick up. I know somebody mentioned at one time that he used to haul blocks during the Depression. And it was during the Depression that most people think that he lost his farm. And indirectly he did, but actually he lost it due to a, I guess what you'd call a grocery bill that he owed. He swapped out the farm, which was actually his mother's property, in exchange for this grocery bill being paid off. And he almost was killed at this time. Sometime during the early part of the Depression, he was working for the WPA, and a tree fell on him. Supposedly left him out in the woods for hours before they ever found him, and when the people found him, they thought he was dead. Took him to the local funeral home, and the mortician was sticking his arm with the embalming needle to prepare the body when he woke up. And so, you know, he was hurt real bad, and if you look closely, you can see how his left arm is real severely deformed. And as a result, he was disabled, and this was back in the days when welfare was just getting started. So rather than go on welfare, he decided that he'd rather go on the road with his goats. Couldn't do anything else for a living. And he had Sadie sew up goatskin clothes and sort of looked like Robinson Crusoe. And he dressed Albert Jean, his son, up in goatskin clothes and had a couple of covered wagons. And they took off to the road, decided to go to the World's Fair again, traveled around a while. And then finally, Sadie got tired of it, and should I say about selling her? Yeah. Okay. Finally, Sadie got tired of traveling. He got tired of her. She fell in love with a local farmer, and they worked out a deal where the farmer paid the goat man two $500 payments in exchange for Sadie, and basically he sold her. And this is, it's rumor, but it seems to be substantiated by some of the facts I've heard in Sigourney.
She was a little subnormal intelligence. She wasn't really that smart. And to tell you the honest to goodness truth, I never could figure out how that husband swapping happened. Because the man that Charlie sold her to was well thought of and supposedly a pretty intelligent man. I never could figure that one out. Nobody else could, though.
Well, I heard that it happened in front of your house.
Right out in the middle of the street.
Well, what did Sadie have to say about it?
Oh, Sadie was always looking for somebody to crawl in bed with. She was not too serious about anything.
Oh, okay. But she didn't really care.
She kind of made eyes at Casper, I think, and between them they thought it'd be a good idea.
Well, she was from down around Sigourney somewhere. I don't know where he got acquainted with her, but she was she was the mother of this child, and I don't know. She run a business of her own. It wasn't the most honorable business, but it was a business. So,
and the two $500 payments paid for the divorce for the goat man, paid for the divorce for the farmer, and I guess the wedding for the farmer and Sadie. Though from what I've been told, Sadie always had her eye on the goat man. Whenever he came back to town, she always went out to see him and never quite forgot him. And I believe she died within the last couple of years or so. And the girl that the farmer divorced was in the same nursing home with her and died about the same time, I believe.
Events that took place during the Great Depression proved to be too much for Charlie McCartney, and being completely broke with only the goats and wagon, he set out on the road, and with the idea from the book Robinson Crusoe, dressed his son Albert Jean and himself in goatskins, and had a postcard made. People would come by and stop and buy these postcards from him, and with that, Charlie McCartney discovered a way to finance his travels.
My husband and I, he was a long-distance trucker, and I also had a chauffeur's license, and I used to drive with him some, and we had a meat market, too, for 22 years in town here. And we were coming out of Joliet one day, and we ran into this real huge traffic jam, just miles and miles. And as I said, my husband was a little impatient, so he said, I'm going to find out. So he pulled out, and we zipped on up. I bet there were 30 vehicles. Pulled in, and there was Charlie and his goats up ahead and the barefooted kid long behind. See, now this has been quite a while ago because the kid was 10 maybe, barefooted. And my husband said, well, there's old Charlie. We've got to see Charlie. And I said, step on it. We don't want to see Charlie. Yes, I do. So he pulled off. And old Charlie crawled out and started coming across there. Well, hello, Artie. Then he walked up to me and he says, hi, sis. Just like that. Oh, I never did like that man, to tell you the truth about it.
My earliest recollection of Charlie would be probably when I was about 7 years old, thereabouts, when this man with the goats came to our city of Delta, and I wanted to go see the man with those goats. And my mother said something about he was relation, and I said, how is he related? And she said, on your dad's side. And my dad spoke up and said, no, it isn't, it's on your mother's side. But he wouldn't take me to see the man with the goats. And it wasn't then until I was much older, probably in my teens, when I learned that he really was related to me as on my dad's side.
Charlie was becoming well known as the man with the goats, and his travels were taking him further and further away from his Sigourney home. In the late 1930s, early 1940s, Charlie McCartney headed his team of goats south. With his postcard business intact, he started a new vocation, preaching.
Then later on, when the goat man left Iowa for good, basically, he went down to Georgia, and somewhere in North Georgia, he went out in the mountains where all the hillbillies lived, and they thought he was Jesus Christ because he had the long flowing hair, long beard, and that wasn't, very common at that time. So he didn't say anything to discourage them from believing that, and they were giving him donations of money and food and all sorts of things because they figured, this was Jesus come back preaching to them. Then later, when they found out that it wasn't, Jesus that was there with them, they rode him out of town on a rail after they tarred and feathered him. And he had to head on down to South Georgia, where he eventually settled in a place called Jeffersonville, which is just outside of Macon, about 20 miles outside of Macon. And when he went there, this was during the war years, about 1941, early part of 42, and he was coming in that big old clankety wagon, junk hanging all over it, 1 million goats running around it, and some of the local citizens there decided that he had to be a spy for either the Nazis or the Japanese, more likely the Nazis, and that he had a shortwave radio hidden in his wagon, and he was relaying information back on who knows what. I mean, there's nothing out there. This is the middle of nowhere, and the only industry out there that I know of is the kaolin mines, and I guess he was relaying information about that strategic industry. So they sicked the sheriff on him. The sheriff went out there, checked him out, and Mr. McCartney said, well, you just do whatever you want, throw me in jail, check my wagon out, and you're not going to find any shortwave radio. And later on, the deputy sheriff, I think his name was Cannon, said that he was more like a prophet from the house of David than a Nazi spy. And he, basically he was harmless, and they let him go. He headed on down to Savannah but came back, and somebody, I believe, gave him the land or sold him the land real cheaply, and he settled in that part of the country and was there ever since. And in fact, his son still lives in a school bus on the same property that he had his house and mission church.
In the early 40s, the Goat Man, as he was now referred to, had declared that Twiggs County, Georgia was now his home, and that is exactly what it became. For the next few years, the Goat Man would leave his home and travel out into the nation to sell postcards and raise money to build a church on his land in Jeffersonville. According to a Macon newspaper article, the Reverend Captain Charles McCartney, known familiarly through at least 7 states as the Goat Man, is back in these parts again. Accompanied by a herd of 15 nannies and billies, to say nothing of an almost overwhelming aroma, the 45-year-old bearded itinerant preacher has returned to Macon and its environs, with the avowed objective of erecting a church. While his bleating flock is some 18 miles out of town, the Goat Man may be seen from time to time on downtown streets, a large flabby ledger in hand, soliciting subscriptions towards his own building fund. The church was built, and because the Goat Man claimed to be a member of no denomination, named his church the Free Thinking Mission. The Goat Man was very insistent as to his personal mission, and that mission was to preach the religion of Jesus Christ. The Goat Man stated in a newspaper interview that he tried to be humble in doing the Lord's work, and that the most frequent question he was asked was, "What is God?" He stated the same question was asked of Jesus Christ when he was upon this earth, and apparently the people hadn't gotten the word yet. Our preachers, rabbis, and priests are missing the boat. They should be preaching God and better living. I fear that many of our ministers, whether Jewish, Protestant, or Catholic, are more interested in the almighty dollar than in the almighty God. I feel, though, that preaching about the second coming of Christ is a bit foolish, for too many people haven't yet heard about the first coming.
One of the things I remember distinctly growing up in the South was that everywhere you went, you used to see signs on the side of the road saying, "God is not dead, repent, Jesus is coming." And from what I've gathered, basically the Goat Man was the guiding light behind these signs starting back in the 30s. He'd go around, and everywhere he stopped, he'd put up one of these signs and preach under it. And his favorite message was always heaven and hell. Hellfire and damnation was the stock and trade he had as far as his preaching. And he was a member of some United Pentecostal type church. I'm not sure exactly which. But he would go from town to town preaching. And he'd also started little, what he'd call mission churches. And he had one in Savannah, I know of, and I've verified that. He did indeed have one there on the waterfront. But it ended up becoming a bar after he gave up because it was so rough and ready down in that area during the war years. He supposedly started a little log cabin church down in Louisiana on the bayou somewhere. And then his home in Jeffersonville was actually called the Free Thinking Christian Mission. And it doubled as his home with a dirt floor and basically a little church. And you could see crosses on it, and it had a steeple. And a lot of his postcards related back to that home/mission church. But what was unusual was that the area he lived in is basically a black community, and the area he lives in is basically a black community, and so his parishioners were all the local black people who happened to come, and I don't know how many ever actually attended, but there were some who attended his church services. And he was occasionally heard on the radio when people would come out and interview him when he was traveling. But other than that, there's not a whole lot that's known about it because not a lot has survived. Though in my book, I know I've got page after page where most of the postcards have a Christian theme to it because that was one of his main things. But what was so interesting was a lot of people would tell you that he would preach in one side of his face and then the other face he'd turn around and cuss you out, especially if you got in his way and made a smart comment to him. And I thought that was unusual for somebody to be preaching and then turn around and cursing. And the trip I made to Iowa with Jimmy sort of opened my eyes because people up north tend to use four-letter words a little bit more often than we do in the South, especially among churchgoers. And it was done without malice. It was just basically the culture, I guess, and just a different way of speaking. And that was one of his northern habits, I guess you could say, that stayed with him the whole time he was out on the road. And he didn't mean it. He was just as dead serious about his preaching and everything that he was saying. But he would cuss a blue streak from what I was told. Still does.
Pretty well demonstrated that he had more of an impact on people than he ever realized during his travels or afterward. I don't think he's ever been aware just how much of an impact he's had on a lot of people. And it's an unlikely thing anyway that some itinerant, very earthy, close to the earth, marginally existing person like the Goat Man would really affect people. But I think there was an appeal, kind of ethereal thing that most people couldn't well define, which he represented a kind of freedom that most people would never realize themselves. So they vicariously got some pleasure out of just knowing a person like that, a person that was totally unencumbered by the rules and regulations of the ordinary citizen. And I think you could easily say that of all the eccentrics, at least that I've met, that Mr. McCartney is the least affected by convention. He is as spontaneous as you can get. He has his own mental process. It's a little different. You can see a lot of intelligence there, but it's slightly skewed so that you get a different perspective of a world and his own view of the world. He loved people loved him, but at the same time he would not go even a millimeter out of his way to try to impress anyone. He could care less how you reacted to him at the time, and he heard mixed reactions all the time he was on the road. He was, for 40 years, an object of curiosity and fascination by usually fairly large groups of people wherever he was seen. And very frequently almost oblivious to the crowd of people around him. He would sit and read, and people would just stand. Back in the 40s and 50s, people didn't have that much to do, and they would just stand and talk about him or talk to him or with him, and remarks that would not be welcome, they would not be flattering, and occasionally he would respond, usually with a lot of wit.
The Goat Man's mouth on more than one occasion got him into trouble. Back in the 40s and again back in the 50s in the South, he made the mistake of bragging that he was the son of a Yankee general. And outside of Selma and outside of Montgomery also, a group of drunken Southern boys decided that they didn't like it too much. And this was back in the early days of the Civil Rights Movement and the Freedom Riders, and they didn't take too kindly to some Yankee coming down telling them what to do and bragging that his great-granddaddy was some famous Yankee general, and they basically rioted and were throwing rocks and bottles and everything else they could find at him, and he had to beat a hasty retreat, I guess if you could call rolling down the road with a 2-ton wagon and goats of beating a hasty retreat, but he had to actually leave. They got after him, and on more than one occasion the Klan would come after him and ride him out of town because of the problems they felt he was causing.
It was a mistake to challenge Mr. McCartney to any kind of a verbal, not a battle, but even a kidding about his lifestyle, his appearance, the odors that were always associated with him. Because he had such a sharp wit and quick that he could always get in the last word, and you would be the one that was humiliated, if anyone. So he never felt set upon by society. It was kind of a challenge at worst, and he usually handled people very well. He mixed serious advice with kidding and preaching with rather foul language, none of which he thought of as unusual, and offended a few people by his language. At the same time, he would engage you in a very serious, in-depth religious conversation. So again, he had absolutely no motivation to try to impress anyone by affectation or anything artificial. It was, what you saw was the raw man himself. And I think that all still holds true today. Anyone that's interviewed him, even within the past few years, will know that he says exactly what crosses his mind, and usually there's a little bit of wit and a bite to his responses on occasion. But one thing I've never heard applied to him as an adjective is boring.
Through the 50s and into the 60s, the goat man traveled this great nation, preaching the gospel, talking politics, and selling his postcards.
The goat man made his living basically from donations where people would pay to hear him preach, but even more so, he sold postcards of himself and his goats. He would sell them 1 for a quarter, 2 for 50 cents, or 3 for $1. And usually by the person who bought 3 for $1 realized that it didn't mathematically work out, they were too embarrassed to go back and ask for 4 for $1, so they just let it lie, and he would make his money that way. He also would sell pamphlets and booklets that he had written, or people had ghost written for him, on his campaign for president, his life as a goat man, and he'd sell those for 50 cents. And you know, back then he didn't have a whole lot of overhead buying little goat feed and hay, and you know, people would bring him food a lot of times, so he was able to sock a little money away. And in fact, that gave rise to one of the big rumors about him being filthy rich. And I've had people swear to me that they saw where he had gone to cash a check, nobody would let him cash it because they said, "You're a scrungy old character," you know, he couldn't have any kind of money. And so he said, "Well, call my bank back in Jeffersonville." And when they'd call the bank, sure enough, the bank would tell them if it's not over $100,000 or $50,000 or whatever, you know, the different stories had it differently, but it was good. And so people will swear that he was rich. And different people claim to have met him as far away as Washington State, California, Massachusetts, you name it, they met him. And the goat man himself claimed to have visited every state but Hawaii. And the only reason he didn't go to Hawaii was because his goats couldn't swim. And he figured that if he did get there, that the goats would eat the grass skirts off the hula dancers, so he decided to just leave Hawaii alone. But at any given time, there were probably 11 or 12 different goat men traveling in the United States. He was just the one who made it everywhere. Most of the other goat men were more regional, and a lot of times they were veterans who had lost their legs to wars or train accidents. And there was a well-known goat man out in Texas named John Rose who traveled with Angora goats. But Mr. McCartney made it a habit of visiting every state that he could, and some states on a regular basis. He had regular routes going up north in the spring, coming down south in the wintertime, and basically traveled like the birds do with the weather and with the seasons. But he always had a way of getting around that most people didn't realize, and that was with U-Haul trucks. And on occasion, if he was in a hurry to beat the weather back, he would pack his goats and wagons up in a truck and haul them back down south. And one story that was told to me happened up in the Smoky Mountains, where he was on one side of the Smokies. Some people saw him. The next day, when they made it all the way through, you know, I mean, miles and miles and miles, there's the goat man traveling down the road. And they stopped and asked him how he made it, 100 miles or more in one day. And he told them this long-winded story about a black bear chasing him and his goats and scaring them so bad they flew through the rest of the Smokies. But actually what he did was he had rented a truck to get him through that part of the mountains. And he wasn't bashful about telling a tall tale. In fact, that was one of his trademarks, was the ability to spin a yarn. The goat man was a wide-reading creature. He read a lot, still reads a lot, was very interested in things like politics. In fact, he ran for president twice, and he ran basically as a Democrat, though he said that he was going to start a goat party and run on his own third-party ticket. And he ran in the election against John F. Kennedy, supposedly, until he met Kennedy. And he decided that, well, the country needed a younger man, and so he backed out of the race, and as a result, we had John F. Kennedy for president instead of the goat man. Things might have turned out a lot differently, but he claimed that he wouldn't roll eggs on the White House lawn, that everybody could retire at 55 and get their Social Security benefits instead of waiting until they hit 65. And then I believe that in 1968 he stumped for George Wallace. He decided he'd jump ship and support George Wallace for president, and in fact went up to Washington, D.C. campaigning for Wallace, selling bumper stickers and watches and things like that. But some people did not take very kindly to the goat man. A lot of people have wonderful memories of him as children. They loved him, even with the odor and the noise and the hoopla that went around. They have very fond memories of him, but there were some people who just saw him as an easy mark, and he was somebody they could pick on, and they would do it. They tipped his wagon over, would feed strong alcohol to his goats and kill them, would, just had beat him up on more than one occasion. And basically what stopped him from traveling anymore was that in 1968 what stopped him from traveling was that in 1968, around August, I believe it was, he was up on Signal Mountain outside of Chattanooga, and that area, from what I gather, is still a pretty rough redneck type area in parts of it. And some people beat him up one night, knocked him over the head, and he ended up with 27 stitches in his head as a result of that. And then they cut the throat of 8 of his goats. And I found this out through the newspapers and several other sources that it actually did occur. And that and the interstates coming through basically caused him to decide that it was time to hang it up. And so he headed on back down to Jeffersonville, stopped around Conyers, Georgia, and had 2 of his goats stolen there, and one ended up supposedly being barbecued, and the other one was tied to the railroad track. And morning train or the night train one sort of scattered it down the railroad tracks, and that was more than he could take, I believe. I think he decided that, that was enough for him, and he hung it up as far as traveling with the goats were concerned. He traveled on, but it was on foot as a hobo after that.
As I recall, first saw the goat man or talked with him in person in 1968. I had seen and heard of his entourage coming through this area of Alabama when I was a child, but never had a chance to really close-up visit with him. And then I thought that opportunity had been lost, but I was working in Georgia in the 60s doing a medical survey and happened to cross him on a back road. Visited with him a few hours then. Then over the interim between 1968 and the mid-80s, I kept thinking about the goat man and wondering what had happened to him. In the meantime, I had become an artist and was doing a series of drawings of anything from eccentric to just unusual older people, and I was convinced that the goat man would be the ultimate subject in this series. So I tried to do some detective work, kind of backtrack and find out what had happened to him. Almost everyone that I talked with about him just swore with all kinds of assurance that he had long since been dead, and many of them even gave very graphic accounts of how he had died. And I assumed that the best I would be able to do for reference work for painting would be to find old photographs and postcards and that kind of thing. So I began a search for that, and during that time, on one visit to an elderly lady's home to pick up a photograph of the goat man, I found that she was ill and being visited by her pastor. And he told me in the visit, well, why don't you just go down and see the old goat man in person? And I said, no, he's dead. And he said, no, he's very much alive, and that a friend of his was a preacher down in South Georgia who saw him very frequently. So I got enough, just a tidbit here and there of information about where he might be, and I located him near Jeffersonville, Georgia, and at the time he was living in an old school bus with his son Gene, and that gave me an opportunity for the first actual meeting, adult to adult, and talked with him about the possibility of getting him to pose for me in a drawing. He made quite an impact the first time I saw him, because I'd traveled to Macon the first time just to meet him, and I had a rider with me from this area. We found the old school buses school bus, one only at that time, where he lived, and talked with Gene, his son, and he was not there. He had been into Macon and was supposedly on his way back, so we waited quite a while. And I still remember very well when he arrived. A very new automobile drove by, stopped there, and it was, as I recall, a black man driving, and let Mr. McCartney out. And I remember saying to my companion, Jerry Chandler, the writer, I said something to the effect that we had a gold mine here, because as an artist, I saw this as a just absolutely perfect subject. The face, the beard, the hair, and the clothing, but all of the objects that he had adorned himself with. Would be hard to interpret if you saw at times how much he did wear in terms of those buttons and just bits and pieces from the side of the road. I don't know what the origin was. I have heard people say that they remember that he did some of that when he was traveling. More so, I think, when he was on the road, everything he saw, every object on the side of the road, he would pick up and put on his wagon. I think that was probably more of the orientation of this kind of characteristic of collecting everything. Nothing was thrown away. The old pieces of automobile tires were thrown in his wagon, and then he used them for fire at night. So most of the things that you would never think of even touching, he would make use of. If he thought it was pretty, it would become an ornament. And I think that kind of carried over into his personal dress and persisted and probably intensified after he quit making the trips with his wagon and still would walk the roads back and forth to Jeffersonville or Macon. He just could not overcome that habit of picking up everything. Now, I've seen that in other people, mostly elderly, I remember an old black man in New Orleans that did that. I thought it was fascinating, and I loved it, but at that time I wasn't in the art field, and I didn't ever think of doing a portrayal of it. But you still see that in a few people. I don't know what the underlying reason is or motivation for doing that.
One of the funniest things I can think of that happened to the Goat Man was back around 1985. And this was just a couple or 3 years before he ended up in the nursing home and his travels were over for good. He decided that he was in love with Morgan Fairchild, the actress.
Yeah, I remember the visit right before he was leaving. He told me he was going to California, which I kind of took with a grain of salt. You know, I didn't expect him to really leave, and because he was at an age he was already saying was over 100 then. And he told me he was going out there, and he said, I'm going to find that little starlet. And I said, what do you mean starlet? He said, movie star. And I said, well, is it anyone I might know? He said, oh, you might have heard of her. Her name's Morgan Fairchild. And this was long before that Saturday Night Live bit, which somehow came up with the same line with a, who is it? John Lovett? Lovett. His line as the pathological liar was always, my wife, Morgan Fairchild. But this was before I ever heard it on television, and this man actually believed it. That's why he was going out there to find her and bring her back to his bus in Macon.
For several months, he kept saying to his son Gene and to other people around that he was going to go to California, find Morgan Fairchild, and marry her. He wanted to move her back to a school bus and live happily ever after. And nobody believed him, of course. And you know, here's an 85-year-old man saying that he was going to find this gorgeous blonde actress and marry her. All of a sudden, he disappeared one day, and nobody could find him for 3 months. Finally, they get a call from Los Angeles, from I believe it's UCLA Harbor Medical Center, saying, we've got the goat man and he wants to come home. And what happened was he hoboed, hitchhiked, took a bus and got out to Los Angeles. And I feel like he actually found Morgan Fairchild, because that was about the time that Saturday Night Live had a skit going on for a long time about some stranger who was after Morgan Fairchild and wanted to marry her. And I feel like he probably found the girl, you know, got kicked out on his ear, I'm sure, and then sort of stuck around Los Angeles for about 3 months until he was mugged, lost some savings bonds he had and some money and a watch, got put in the hospital again, and they called back to Twiggs County where he lived and found out that he was indeed the goat man, and they put him on a plane and shipped him back to Georgia.
If I had to guess now, my best guess would be that there was one other son, and there's no proof of that I know of. I remember when I first asked Gene how many children did Mr. McCartney have. He said 4, and he began to name 4 boys. And I thought at the time he's probably confused, because he named himself, and he named himself as Gene and then as Albert Gene, and that was counted 2 for him. And he thought that there was another brother named Gene. And he named another one, I think Jesse or some other name. And he did mention the same thing that I had recalled from the 60s, a son that had been in the military. Because when I first met the goat man in 1968 on that trip into Georgia, he was on his way at that time to make his last trip around the country. And his intentions were, during that conversation, to go to the White House and talk with the president, who was President Nixon, whom he called Mixon, and to see if the president could not help him locate his son, who was some kind of military person. At that time, he didn't mention it, that he was a pilot, but since that time, he's talked about a son who was a pilot in Vietnam. It could well be that he had a son that was part of a helicopter crew or something like that. But there has to be some semblance of a foundation for that, but I don't know how accurate it is.
Albert Gene McCartney is the only known living son of the goat man. He's about 56 and lives in the school bus in Twiggs County. There are a lot of rumors that have always gone around about the Goat Man having several other wives that I don't know about and having several children. And in fact, he'll tell you that he has a son who lives on the West Coast, a son who lives in New York City, and a daughter, I believe it is, who lives in England. And there supposedly is an ex-wife named Davis who lived in Florida and was the mysterious lady in the Cadillac that used to travel around picking up his money and leaving supplies for him. And he has a son that he's claimed died in either Korea or Vietnam, depends on when you ask him. And one day I actually got a copy of all the names that are on the Vietnam wall, and there is a Robert McCartney who is listed on the wall as having died in Vietnam, and he was from Wisconsin, which is where the Goat Man has cousins who still live there today. And so he may very well have children that I don't know about, and I'm sure there are some somewhere. Just, I haven't been able to prove it.
Now, it's hard to describe Gene because he looks different every time you see him. I mean, just different as daylight and dark. At the same time, he's always so different from anyone else you'll ever see that you think he's the strangest critter you've ever looked at. But every time I've seen Gene, he looks different. To the point where I would have to look twice to know that this is the Gene that I talked with last year or year before. Partly because he dresses very differently at different times. Gene will add or subtract layers of temperature, and he did keep just a big stash of clothes in an old shed, and he would go out, and if he was cold, he'd pull on another pair of pants and a shirt. And even though he's a little delicate boned person, he would look stocky because he would have so many layers of clothing on. And that's the way he looked the first time I saw him. I remember we pulled up near the bus, and this creature came out and walked around there, and it looked like something that might have crawled out of a cave or a coal mine. His face was black with soot, and his hair had been just chopped around so that it lay down and was very bulky, but at the same time squared off. And he looked short and very stout, which was misleading, of course. But at a little bit of a distance, it looked rather fearsome, like you might not want to talk with this person. But of course we did, and found him to be right the opposite. He's almost like a little friendly puppy dog that follows you around. But I think Gene lacked for much of a formal education. I know that he probably had a very hard early life, and being itinerant didn't get a great deal of actual one-on-one or any kind of formal education. But again, I think Mr. McCartney did do a great deal of reading, and maybe he shared some of that with Gene. It would be interesting to hear Gene just pick up an adult book and read it, because I don't know exactly what would come out. I know that we did photograph him one time. He was sitting there reading the Bible, and I just wondered if he really was reading it at the time. But I think a lot of these things he gets his cues from his dad as to who has been photographed all of his life. And of course Gene was also photographed and object of some curiosity, so all of that is kind of programmed in, and he poses a little bit for you and tries to make you happy and comfortable, even though he's anything but comfortable himself.
Iowa. Yeah, we knew that he would come from Iowa, and that's where he came from.
I was born in Iowa City, Iowa. My dad was born in Sigourney, Iowa. And my grandfather was born, one of them in Canada and one of them in Virginia.
Well, how did he happen to settle here?
He's working with during the 1935-40. Well, we owned a big farm up and it
Yeah.
went broke during the Depression. What happened?
Yeah.
And during the we got out, started traveling on a goats and wagon like Indians, up and down the road. Went selling those books and pictures, postcards, and he'd been all 50 states. Had to put him on a boat and truck to go Alaska and Cuba, but I've been all the way over with him, and I'm the one that had him selling those books and pictures and postcards. And he'd been down, he kept coming down, and he got down here, and so he liked it a lot better down south, which we come down here about. That's been down here about, born and raised down here about 50 years, 45, 50 years ago, when we stayed down here.
Mm-hmm.
And bought the land down here, and well, we bought a couple acres of land, and I know our neighbors ain't mostly nothing but cars waiting. He didn't keep his taxes paid up when he took away, so I come over and bought 2 more acres, but I went and paid all my, got all my taxes. My grandma paid the taxes, and he did, and on that, and I paid, but I come over and bought 2 more acres over here. I got all, I didn't, you know what I mean, keeping all that stuff, you know what I mean.
Yeah, so you, yeah.
But I know who the judge and the sheriff, and kind of way off, I'm kin to the Smiths, not too down in the Mercer, Hammock, Youngblood, all in Florida, been kin to Smiths, but then Dawes, Earl Hammock, no man, they said the 2 oldest people around here was Earl Hammock and the Goat Man, till Earl died, and then the old Stone Sheriff, but I know all these stones up in, you know, the sheriff.
So that's your bus right, John?
Yeah, Ray Wilson, all of them up there, you know what I mean, Macon, all the sheriff and judges, and Johnson, Cleveland, Warren Robbins, those are Davis and Ken. Now, my mother's a Smith, my dad's, he'd been married about 5, my dad been married about 4 or 5 times, and my dad's 4th wife, my mother's Smith, but my dad's 3rd was Davis.
Yeah, you got married the first time at age 14.
He married a young girl, and both a baby girl and his wife, but that's his first wife, but hell, he married 4 times after that. Ask him how many times he says, I'm married 3, he don't want, the Bible says 7 months for every one, but he don't admit it, you know, maybe he been married about 3 or 4, but he's been married about 4 or 5. I stayed the bachelor, no. I stayed the bachelor, 5 brothers. Just got one that died, the youngest died at childbirth. I got one got killed in Vietnam. I got 2 half brothers younger than I am. They married and become a big family.
Mm-hmm.
One in California, one in New York. They're younger, but they.
What does the one do in New York?
I think both of them run the CBS or newspaper reporting work and does cattle work. One runs in DC.
Do you ever see them?
I wouldn't know them. I wouldn't see them if one. No. They know the old man, he knows them. I wouldn't know him if I wasn't see him. He was younger than I am, and they, one of them, Roy, or Eugene McCartney and Robert McCartney, and then the one that got killed in Vietnam was, my name's Albert Gene McCartney, and Russell, my youngest, died at childbirth, and Roy and Eugene and Roy, yeah, Eugene and Roy, one in California, one in New York.
Now, were they all by the same woman?
No, 2. The last 2 that we were the Smith Hart, and the other 2 was the Davis. And they all under the same, all under the same husband, but under different wives. One Davis, and my dad's 3rd wife. His Davis and Smith Hart. My dad Smith Hart, and Davis.
What's this building here?
That's where my grandmother and stepfather buried, and put them in bought Hart's Funeral Home. That's the Thomas Funeral Home. Buried them in there about 30, 35. Well, hell, I don't know. They've been dead about 30, 35, 40. Long time. Thomas Hart's Funeral Home, Macon buried them. That's when Dad's grandma and stepfather put in there buried in there. Put them in the coffins and put fluid in and sealed them up. That's where they're going to bury me and old man. When he died, they're going to bury him out there where they bury me.
That's your place right there, huh?
Yeah, we got 2 acres. Yeah, that's the place, our place.
Let's go and look at the buses, can we?
Cool. making one. I just wanted to cook off my neighbors. See, the way I cook in my bus, I got a wood stove, and I got me a kerosene stove. When I get electricity, I cook off a wood stove.
Oh, yeah.
Kerosene. I get out here, you see me a lot, I'll have to build me a fire over there, or I'll build me a fire in that pine tree. And you know what I mean? Everything you cook or eat canned good to cook on my wood stove. You know what I mean? Buy to cook.
Well, you got a few tin cans here. I mean, aluminum cans here.
I ain't had no job. I went off. What I'd done for about 20, 25 years. Went off to Florida, down around Jacksonville, and come home. But the hell, I ain't had done nothing about 10, 15 years, but I worked with one of my cousins and his wife down there about 25 years, and then I worked for a guy who had an animal farm named Colin. One was Franklin, the other had an animal barrel, man.
He said that the goats are in Florida now?
Oh, what happened, he eat part of them died, and he sold, give part of them away, eat part of them, and sold give part of them to their neighbors. They supposed to took the two old wagons, what you talking about, the goats and the wagons, and put them in that museum. I don't know where they still got them down there in Ross and in Sarasota. I don't know where they still down there. Ocala, you know where they had the museum? I don't even know where they still got those wagons down there or not, because see, that's 25, 30 years. That's a long time ago.
Yeah, he's been off the road a long time. He still has.
But I bought this, this is about 70, I'm on 65, 70. They wouldn't sell me one in Twigg County. This come from Jones County. But I know I bought this bus, so about 20 years, the 70s, that's pretty much about. I was going to put shelves. I ain't never got around to putting shelves. Go in there, walk on in there and look at them. I just put some table and bed and stuff on there. Might not pick it up someday, I don't know. They go with them back down the corner from old bread. But one of these days I'll take out a wood stove out and put the kerosene heater, you know, a little kerosene stove. Got it. I just got 2 tables, and I left some of the seats. I guess the old man doing pretty good. I guess he's getting on all right.
Yeah, he was doing real good.
I stopped in the last time I was visiting, about, one time we had this place built up and we had a fish pond, but the neighbor went down there and built and blowed it down back there in the back, so I ain't never got around to fixing it. Like the fish pond down there. Nothing but colored people. Well, I ain't trying to judge the critics, throw nothing off them, because we've got 6 different, you know what I mean, 5, 6 different colored race, nice and races of people in here. I don't know, I'm on with all
Your dad's a minister, right?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, he says he used to travel up and down the road. He started preaching about 40, a long time, about 45, 50, supposed to be a church, like the Holy Bible, Church of God, or Christian, Church of Pentecostal, Church of God, and Pentecostal preacher. Supposed to be a preacher's son. I try to live right, hard to live by the 10 Commandments and do right, but he claims they take him out and let him preach and bring and he used to travel up and down the road and preach when he traveled up and down the road and do a lot of preaching, selling those books and pictures and postcards of the goats and wagon and stuff.
Do you have any of the old postcards and all that y'all used to have?
I don't think we have got any now. All right.
"1988 saw basically the last hurrah for the Goat Man. He ended up in the nursing home at that time, and that was the last he was to ever travel again. He was getting so old and bent and frail that for his own good, I think he was made a ward of the state and placed in the nursing home. And, you know, he would have stayed there, and that would have been the end of it if it hadn't been for Larry Martin's print. And it seems like the more time goes by, the more popular the Goat Man's becoming because of that print. And just so many people from that age group are getting older and remembering their childhood. And everywhere I go, people remember the Goat Man. Everywhere. It's amazing how many people remember him. And people have gone to the nursing home to see him. When I went, I was just thoroughly thrilled. It was like meeting a celebrity. And he's just old, bent over, all crooked, that old bent over arm. And he looks just like he's about to shrivel up and float away. But he's, you know, still stroking along. He's been, you know, able to talk to you, carry on a conversation, and he has a hard time remembering things. But he does, you know, he'll get on a loop and he'll tell you stories about the 3,000 years being up and Jesus' return, about Lady Bird, his horse, being out in Foster's pasture, and about the UFOs that come up over there all the time and scare Lady Bird. And he'll tell you that's how he hurt his leg, was they came up and scared Lady Bird, and she drug him across the road and broke his leg, I believe it was. And he's a big celebrity at the nursing home now. And he has a girlfriend, a retired nurse there, that they go to bowling games and have their dates in the lunchroom, and he wheels her around, and he's just a fascinating character to me still. He's not in his prime, but he's still an interesting person to sit and talk to.
I'm Helen Smith, and I have been working here at Eastview for 8 years. I'm social service and activities. Social services has to do with quality of life, and activities has to do somewhat with the same, a little bit overlapping. And I've worked with Mr. Charlie ever since he was admitted here. And we've been through a lot of funny things. When he first came in, of course, he had to have a lot of tests done, a lot of battery of things done. And we went to the medical center several times together. One of the funniest things that happened was that he had to go for some tests, and he had to be NPO, which means he can't have anything to eat. So we got down to the medical center, and we had to park on the top story, and he was having an awful lot of problems with his feet, and I might near had to carry him in there, but we finally got in, and he had all his little tests done, and we talked to all the people we were supposed to talk to, and we were in the lab, and he had had his blood drawn, and he went to the bathroom there in the lab, and he stayed, and he stayed, and he stayed. So I decided I better go check on him. So I went in there, and he couldn't quite reach down to pull his trousers up, so I reached down to help him, and when I did, he hiked his coat up, and when I did, 2 cartons of milk poured out over my head, that on him, and he had carried a supply of grub with him to the hospital because they had told him he couldn't eat, so he wanted to be sure he was going to get something. So he had 2 open cartons of milk and several pieces of toast that he had collected before we got down there. So I got baptized that day with a milk bath, but we had some real funny things happen to us. What else you want me to say about you?
Nothing, no. I'll let you do the show.
He does real well. He has a friend here, a special friend, that he spends a lot of time with. And Mr. Charlie comes to all the parties, and he doesn't participate too much in the parties, but he sure does enjoy the eating part. That's the best part, the eating part. And he bowls. You like to bowl, don't you? You bowl. And I think you've won a time or two, haven't you? Haven't you won the tournament a time?
Yes, Mom.
He likes to bowl. That's probably his favorite thing to do other than tell stories. We had one volunteer that came out and stayed with him a good bit, and she brought him some goat's milk. And
I go down there to that hill store and buy a quart every day.
He thought it was awful.
And drink it right down.
He had thought it was terrible. I even carried him to the fair, and I thought he'd enjoy the petting zoo with all the goats at the Georgia State Fair. And so we got down there to the petting zoo, and he sort of ignored them. So I said, Mr. Chess, would you like to go over here and pet the goats? He said, Lord, no, I've had my fill of those. I want to pet the goats. So I don't know why. I never have been able to figure out all these strings. See here, now you know what this is? This is strings out of his bedspread. He mutilates a bedspread a day and a towel a day. See, I'm just not sure how much he's worth. I don't know whether he's worth a bedspread and a towel a day. But this is the bedspread that's on his bed, and it's one of those thermal bedspreads that sells for about $30 each, and he does one in a day. We try to give him the same one, but he mutilates it. I mean, you can't give him the same one. That's his bedspread. Don't you think the fact that you traveled about and took life easy and took life slow, that you had more of an opportunity to talk to God?
Sure, certainly.
Yeah, I think that's true. Sometimes we get too busy, and when we get so busy, then we can't even hear God.
Well, that's human environment.
Mr. Charlie, when you were a boy growing up, what church did you go to?
Well, my folks were all, my dad and mother was good Christians. They went to all churches, different churches. They went to all churches.
Mm-hmm. And when you were going across the country, traveling, what church did you go to?
And I just park and preach the Word of God anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, you said you built churches. What kind of churches did you build?
Well, I built a church in Savannah.
Mm-hmm. What kind of church was it?
I don't know what it was. It was a beautiful church. And by gosh, it was a speakeasy there when the First World War, or Second World War was going on. And by God, they just butcher each other and cut each other to pieces like dogs. And sailors and soldiers to get together. By God, and get drunk and they just cut each other all the time.
This was at church?
Huh?
This was at church? You said this happened at church?
No, I know. I built a church.
Oh, you built a church to prevent that. I see what you're saying.
That's right. I built a church there. I went out and built it within 6 months. I had a nice church built.
I see what you're saying. They were so evil, so you built a church. I understand. What kind of work did you do after the farm?
Christ's sake, woman, I run 300 acres.
I know, but after that, after you left the farm, did you ever work anywhere?
Why, yes, I drove my goats down the road and sold pictures, honey.
Oh, okay, I see.
That's the way I created my job.
So you were self-employed?
Huh?
Self-employed.
That's right. That's right. I try to tell you everything.
But I tell you what, I don't believe I could sell enough pictures of myself to eat. So
oh, by God, I done all right. I ain't nothing to kick about that. I done all right.
Since then, I haven't printed, but I have painted an original of Mr. McCartney with his friend, Miss Tanner. And it's a close-up view of the two of them with their crowns. They were crowned king of the nursing home, and king and queen of the nursing home. And the title of it is Sweethearts of Eastview Nursing Home. And I just tried to capture a little of that expression showing the relationship of the two, and I think she totally has changed his approach to life since he's been at the nursing home. I think he would have fought it from the very beginning until the end if he had not met her there. And he loves it, loves every minute there, gets homesick when he's away from there. There have been two occasions that where we have had the Goat Man as a special guest at art exhibitions, one in our own gallery here. That was in September of '91, and then again in a Marietta, Georgia gallery this past year. In all instances, when people find out, there are always a great number of people waiting to see the Goat Man and talk with him, and usually to get a print with his image and his signature. It's been fascinating because I didn't know what kind of reaction to expect when we first had that open house in this gallery with him, and didn't know what kind of people this would attract and how they would respond to him now. It was universally positive. People were very enthusiastic, very emotional, nostalgically about the memories, that their own personal memories that they associated with Mr. McCartney, usually from their childhood, still remembering him from that time as an old man that would frequent their area once or twice a year. There was always fascination mixed with affection for him, and some very emotional type reactions to him. And I think that pretty well demonstrated that he had more of an impact on people than he ever realized during his travels or afterward. I don't think he's ever been aware just how much of an impact he's had on a lot of people. And it's an unlikely thing anyway that some itinerant, very earthy, close to the earth, marginally existing person like the Goat Man would really affect people. But I think there was an appeal, kind of ethereal thing that most people couldn't well define, which he represented a kind of freedom that most people would never realize themselves, so they vicariously got some pleasure out of just knowing a person like that, a person that was totally unencumbered by the rules and regulations of the ordinary citizen.
Mr. McCarthy, I remember you from North Georgia from years ago.
Yours, who I was on the road.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember, my grandparents owned Manus Grocery. You used to
Where's you at?
at Manus Grocery in Cohutta, Georgia.
Cohutta, Georgia, remember that?
Yeah. We'd like my please.
Okay, you can tell us about buying this postcard from him.
Well, by golly.
How about that?
That's a real picture of it.
See the date on it?
1963. Well, we're right there.
Can we get him to sign it for us?
Yeah, let me look at it. I want to see if it
That's a real picture. I used to tell them.
But I've been seeing you for a long, long time. When I was just a little bitty girl. Even one time I remember I brought you your dinner one night when you were camped out on Rossville Road.
Yes, Mom.
I brought you something. Did you?
Well, I thank God I'm no more at all.
Well, I think you're looking wonderful. Just wonderful.
There's nothing you can do for it.
I draw $300 a month, and what at the end of the month, if I don't spend it all, I give the Salvation Army. I can go there anytime I want.
Yes, sir.
Sometimes I spend the whole $300. If I don't, I give 50 or 75 every month to the Salvation Army. By God, I can go down there and get anything I want. I appreciate kindness. That's right, and I used to preach Christ. I preached God's Word. I believe in God Almighty. There had to be a God Almighty. And when I say the only two true religions, Jehovah's Witness and Christian Science, the rest is hogwash. Two true religions, Jehovah's Witness and Christian Science. The rest is nothing, just hearsay.
But aren't you an ordained minister in the...
I was, yes. I let my license run out. I still preach the Word of God and know the career of God. Well, we got the finest public schools on earth. And by God, I thought the kids was crazy up in Indianapolis. Indianapolis State Capital. By God, the little children asked me if we originated from monkeys. I said, what in the hell's the matter, you children? Teaching in public school, a civilized nation, preaching the kids that we originated from monkeys. Why, that's peculiar. Now, I got a pony, and they don't make no noise yet. And they go across my place out here where I live in Trigg County. They go at night. And that goddamn pony, she'd break loose and it'd take me a week to find her. She just hated them. And I put her in foster pasture. And she just hated them. By God, they didn't make no noise. But by God, I found her. It took me a week to find her. By God. Yeah, my mother and stepdad's buried there in the vault,
Yeah, I saw it last time I was down there.
Yes, sir. I'm putting mine there right by the road, $1,000 one. 500 paid and 5 when they finish it. Boy, Christ, if you didn't, they'd throw you out and let the dog eat you. Sure, they wouldn't. That's human environment. They don't mean no harm. They might be smart people, but that's the ignorant way to do it. You got to prepare for yourself before you die. When you don't, they don't care. If you ain't saying enough to prepare for yourself, they'll just throw you out of this. They won't worry about it.
Ches McCartney's world changed, they tell me, when he met up with this knife-throwing lady. He married her in the traveling life, God in his soul. He built a wagon, hitched his goats, off he'd go. Oh, the goat man headed on down the road, going anywhere heart told him to go. Nannies and Billies pulling his load. Goat man, he's like a rolling stone. He had many wives and sweethearts along the way. I hear tell he still got a sweetheart somewhere in L.A. For 40 long years he was on the road, always coming back to his Georgia home. Oh, the goat man headed on down the road, going anywhere heart told him to go. Nannies and Billies pulling his load. Goat man, he's like a rolling stone. He was a reverend and a philosopher, all rolled into one. There wasn't much old Ches hadn't done. He drove through the storms and the darkest nights, If you haven't met the goat man, you've missed a part of life. Oh, the goat man headed on down the road, going anywhere heart told him to go. Nannies and Billies pulling his load. Goat man, he's like a rolling stone.